Sitting down today with distinguished Canadian journalist Kevin Newman, and we're discussing all things related to the Afghan interpreter rescue operation. This operation was a failure from start to finish, and Kevin Newman has a very, very good perspective as to what went wrong and what we can do in order to start fixing this moving forward as a country. An episode not to miss. Stay tuned. Looking to shed a few of those COVID-19 pounds, looking to get a little bit stronger and improve mental clarity, make sure that you're super dialed in at work and at home. Over the summer, the team here at Dave Moore PT has been building these programs out. So if you head to davemoore.net/training programs, you'll find one of my favorite programs called The Beast. This program is designed for the seasoned veteran, the dad, the grinder, making things happen at home, in their community, at work. This is an 8-week program that I built based off of my experience. It really focuses on ensuring that your metabolic health and your testosterone levels are optimized. So if that sounds like a good program, a good fit for you, head to davemoore.net/training programs. Find The Beast. I guarantee that you are going to lose 10 pounds. And additionally, you're going to start dialing in your life and feeling a whole hell of a lot better by the end of that 8 weeks. So if that sounds like a good deal for you, head to davemoore.net/training programs and get on The Beast today.
Welcome to the Hard to Kill podcast, the go-to podcast for military, LEO, and EMS professionals, sharing ideas and experiences from around the world to make you hard to kill. Here's your host, Dave Morrow.
Welcome, folks, to another episode of the Hard to Kill podcast. I'm sitting down with distinguished journalist Kevin Newman, and it's so cool to have you on the podcast, Kevin, because I mean, I don't know if most people know if or how much of an influence you had in this whole Afghanistan exfiltration, but I don't think it would have got the attention that it did had we not had allies like yourself. So it's a real honor to have you here. And let's talk a little bit about yourself and how you got involved and where do you think this is all going as a country and you know, your perspective. So Kevin, how did you get to the level that you're at right now? And, you know, what got you into journalism? And then, you know, what also led you into like, not only journalism, but you've been in Afghanistan a bunch of times. It's pretty cool. So, you know, give the listeners that maybe don't know your background so much a little taste of where you're coming from.
Yeah. So I guess the quality, thanks, Dave, is curiosity. I've always been a curious person, whether it was through school or whatever. And I think at about, you know, in high school, I used to watch, you know, the greats of the TV anchors do things like the moon shots and Vietnam coverage, and I thought, wow, that looks like a really cool way to spend a life. Not in as deep on things as you have been, but pretty close. And so I went to Western. I did not take journalism. I took economics and politics, but I started up a campus radio station there, and then I wrote a fan letter to a female reporter at a TV station in Toronto claiming that I was the head of her fan club. It was a lie. It was a lie. But it got her attention and she got a kick out of it. And I said to her, I said, you know, I'm not, you know, I am a fan of your journalism and I think you do a really good job, but there's no real fan club. I was just trying to get your attention. Anyway, so long story short, I get to shadow her for a while. I got my foot in the door at Global News in Toronto. And then, you know, as they say, the rest is history. I worked at the CBC here for a while. I worked at ABC News in New York for a while, at Good Morning America and World News Tonight. Traveled a little bit in the Middle East there. Spent some time in Israel, in Iraq, during the weapons of mass destruction talks. And then left ABC just before 9/11 to start up Global National. And like, you know, so many Canadians, that was sort of the seminal moment that, you know, a whole lot of my life became disrupted and I had different sort of perspectives on things. So, and then as part of Global Nationals, anchored right after Op Medusa in southern Afghanistan, in Kandahar, got outside of the wire. And I think that was where I really gained a real appreciation for the men and women in uniform who had not really been a big part of my life at that point, because they were our protection. and B, they were just such fine examples of Canadiana, and I was very proud to be there with them and get a better understanding of the sacrifice of service.
Mm-hmm. Dare I ask who the journalist was?
Yeah, sure. It was Christina Pokmursky, who is still with us. Did a lot of documentary work, and I don't know if I'm allowed to say this in these days, but had very long legs that were often shown on television. So.
Since we're being so honest, I've always had a crush on Lisa LaFlamme. I don't know what it is.
Have you?
Yeah. Well, I don't know what it is.
Set up a meeting.
Oh, geez, you're going to make me blush. I hope my wife's not listening.
Yeah, well, she was in Afghanistan more than I was. She was in there, like, she had 6 different tours. And, a lot of people don't know this about Lisa, but she's been very active in this extraction as well, trying to bring out the family of an interpreter that she worked with while she was in Afghanistan. Our interpreter is in Islamabad now. He got out a couple of years ago. Okay. But as you know, lots of former interpreters are getting nervous about being in Pakistan and would like to be moved on from there too.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that Lisa's been involved in our efforts, although we haven't had any contact directly. I could tell in people's eyes. Like, I remember seeing you on the newscast and CTV, and I was like, this guy's switched on. And Lisa LaFlamme has that same kind of, those eyes that
we're both drivers.
Checked out, dialed in, ready to go, and can make stuff happen. So I'm not surprised that she's involved in this. And then you said you started Global National. Now I'm just 40, and I remember Global National, and I don't remember it. I remember always it being. I don't remember like it being created. I just grew up with a bit of news.
Well, that makes me so happy.
So I'm assuming that's in the 90s, right? It got started.
It was 2001.
It was 2001.
Literally 6 days after 9/11. Yeah.
Wow.
And the fact that it just feels like an institution to you and it's always been there makes me feel really happy, because my mission was to create this third national newscast that someday, 20 years later, someone like you would say, yeah, of course. I didn't know it even had a beginning that was that recent.
Oh, that's amazing. I didn't know that, actually. That's really interesting. So therefore, you took your experience and then got to go to Afghanistan. How was that for you? Like, how was it, just being on the ground as a journalist, having, did you go to Bosnia? Did you have any prior war experience? Like,
I did. Yeah. I was in Bosnia. I covered the refugee story there for ABC's Nightline. I went in Iraq when the United Nations was trying to find weapons of mass destruction. I went into Baghdad, which was quite a trip. At the time, there was a no-fly zone. You couldn't get into Iraq directly, so you had to go to Amman, Jordan, and hire a car and a service and a driver to basically take you 16 hours in the desert into Baghdad. And I was hiding in the back seat of the car, and because they didn't want Americans into Baghdad, so I spent most of the drive in the back seat of the car with a blanket over me. And this is how long ago it was. I had a Walkman because I was trying to keep myself calm. And, music's a good motivator when you're in places that are strange. And so I was listening to like really calming music because, we kept hitting checkpoints after checkpoints. And I don't know. Yeah. So I'm thinking like there's this guy who looks like an American hid in the back of the car. And it was a little scary, I'll say, but somehow we got ourselves through. I think the driver paid bribes at each of the checkpoints. And then, I spent a week in Baghdad with the UN weapons inspectors trying to find the weapons of mass destruction that it turns out really didn't exist.
My stomach is just nervous thinking about being in the backseat of a car driving into Baghdad with no weapons, no support.
16 hours, man.
Oh.
Yeah, and journalists in war zones and hot zones, none of us carry weapons.
No, of course not.
So often, as in Afghanistan, we have protection, which we had from the Canadian Armed Forces, but there was no security guard with me or a guy with a weapon that time. And then you got into Baghdad, and we went to that hotel where at the time they put all of the journalists, and you had to walk over this big mat of a very angry George Bush the first, so that you were wiping your feet on George Bush's face at the entrance to the hotel. The Iraq government loved that stuff. And then you went in and you knew your room was bugged. And so you would write You would talk between colleagues just with little note pieces of paper, and it's weird to be in a busy newsroom in Baghdad and there's virtually no talking going on. There's just people writing and showing each other what they intend to do for that day's file.
Okay, so you bring up something really interesting. Like you guys, I might say you guys, I mean journalists, you guys take risks. Like that's a crazy risk. Like I get nervous just thinking about that. For what I did doesn't seem nearly as ballsy, because I mean I had an entire American Canadian battle group behind me. If things got real, we called in air support. Like who we are when we're walking around. There's no mystery. But for you guys, you're figuring out a way in. You're getting very creative. You're going into a really potentially dangerous zone. But with that being said, clearly you guys are able to take risks. My next question is, how come there was no Canadian journalistic presence during this recent fall in Afghanistan? Where were we? How come we didn't have anybody there? Clearly we have the journalists like yourself that are willing to take risks. Why didn't we have a presence there? What's your thought on that?
Yeah, that was a huge hole because, as you know, the government was saying one thing was going on, and the group of us that were in touch with people on the ground in and around Kabul's airport and in Kabul were getting completely different versions of things. So typically, that's why journalists cover war, because sometimes the generals tell you one thing that is part of their mission plan, and sometimes the Taliban is claiming things that is part of their public relations effort. And journalists are the eyes and the ears that go like, oh, hang on here. That's not what I'm seeing. That's not what I'm being told from other sources. So they're important. And there's Afghanistan war created a generation of war correspondents in Canada where there hadn't been one for practically 2 generations, right, really, since covering the Second World War. So I was surprised there was nobody there either. There was nobody from any of the networks, none of the newspapers. Part of it was financial. People forget that mainstream media, that often derided mainstream media is under extreme financial strain, and a trip into Kabul with no way of knowing when you get out, it costs money. It's about $100,000 for a couple of weeks to keep a correspondent in there, get them there, and all that kind of stuff. And, it sounds like a silly reason, but it was at the end of the fiscal year and a lot of newsrooms didn't have the money to go.
Wow.
And then, there was, everybody too was sort of focused on the deadline that Biden had set at the end of August. So there were many plans for correspondents to go for that date. But then, as we know, the Americans moved it ahead, surprised everybody. And by the end of August, Kabul had fallen and it wasn't clear how you could get in, but more importantly, whether you could get out. Mm-hmm. And so people hesitated until they had a better situational understanding of what the situation was on the ground. But I will say, once that became clear, once it was clear that you could deal with the Taliban at some level, and once the budgets came in from the boss, just about everybody went to Afghanistan in September.
Right. That's interesting. I didn't know about that. That whole fiscal responsibility for.
Yeah, it's a reality. It's not pleasant, but it's a reality.
Yeah. That's an interesting take, because, from my point of view, is just how come everybody else, like the Americans, the Germans, the French, they all have somebody there. And I can't remember if it was you that pointed that out on LinkedIn as well. Like, why aren't we there? There should be somebody at least at the airport, bare minimum. And so that was kind of like a glaring hole of many holes that were exposed during this whole exfiltration of interpreters and locally employed civilians. And I wanted to get just a little bit more context as to how you experienced this, because you were integral to get our message out. We were just a ragtag group of volunteers, veterans, retirees from coast to coast, trying to figure things out as we go along. I was tasked as basically media manager because I knew how to use social media and had a HubSpot account, but I've never done anything on an international level. I didn't know what I was doing. And, handling many interviews, sometimes a day, was a bit daunting, I'll be honest.
It's a big stress.
It is. And, you get your legs after a little while, having never done any journalistic stuff in my life. But from your point of view, you were writing some amazing stuff. And I know you're technically retired, But
I'm not doing well with
you're
that.
not doing very well. You kind of failed at the retirement because you're producing some awesome stuff on Substack. And I want to touch base on just one of those articles, actually two of the articles. The first one I want to touch base on is the one that probably was the most poignant that I read, was the one that we are slow, risk averse, and selfish as a country. And that title alone, like especially the selfishness, was really like it was like a punch in the chest, because, you know, like I grew up, and probably like yourself, like Canada is not a quote unquote selfish country. We go and, you know, deploy our soldiers in countries that need help. We help our brothers, sisters, international community whenever needed. And then when you see it in the headline, when you're in the middle of it and you're like, holy shit, like, yeah, we are being freaking selfish.
Yeah.
Like, you nailed it. What, you know, like, without, you know, getting into all the details, what brought you to that point where you said, you know what, I got to write this, and, you know, Canadians need to get a better picture as to what's actually happening right now?
Yeah, I have not been able to figure out why the things that, as you mentioned, we have done in Syria with the white helmets, in Lebanon, and in many other places where we do send in teams occasionally to sort of extract people. There is a team, NEO, that it trains for this kind of material, but there just seemed to be no connection at the decision-making level between the reality of what former interpreters and local staff were experiencing in Afghanistan and what government politicians and bureaucrats were saying. And so the article that you mentioned, I was pissed off, because I had just watched a minister's press conference where they said that, you know, the extraction is brilliant, and that, you know, 20,000 Afghans were being welcomed to Canada, when I knew that, like, nobody could get out. And there was an attempt to create a happy headline by government that would confuse Canadians into believing that, number one, serious action had been taken, and number two, that people were coming to Canada by the tens of thousands. Neither of those two things are true. And so that day when I watched the minister, I thought, well, the problem here is that there are no reporters there to see it for themselves. But I had been on these secret Zoom calls that we've been having and hearing from people who were actually in Kabul, hearing from some former interpreters that were feeding images into me. And I knew that there was a story being constructed that was not true. And so I thought, somebody's got to write this story. And, you know, normally it would be someone who's at the Globe and Mail or at CTV News. There's nobody there. I will write the story based on 2 or 3 sources that I'm getting on the ground, and the story is very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the word selfish is not how I like to think of our country either. But one of the things that I think people miss is that when you and I were in Afghanistan and others, there was our currency was trust. You know, if you were involved in PSYOPs, you were trying to gain the trust of local people there to get information to keep you safe. And I was there to get people to trust me to tell their stories, Afghans and soldiers. And trust is a very big part of Afghan culture as well. Like when you're in their town and in their village, they are responsible for you, and they take care of you with tea and things like that. And I just felt that when it came to Afghanistan, you know, people like yourself and many others have been banging their heads against the wall, not for like a few months, but for a few years, trying to get government to say, look, we owe these people. We know these people. These aren't refugees or immigrants that we don't know. These people know us. They understand our culture. If they come here, they're going to be integrated that much more quickly. And government would not take action. So, I mean, one of the things, I saw your initial Facebook posts, and I thought, oh, that's cool. Like that guy's onto something, and it's something that a lot of journalists have been frustrated with, and soldiers as well, that they couldn't bring their people out previous to that because there was no process for that. And so, you know, I got in contact with you, and I thought, you know, what can I bring to this? And what I can bring to it is to be a force multiplier within media for saying, hang on, I've got a certain amount of credibility here. I'm telling you, look at this. Something is not right about what's happening here. And the government is telling reporters things that they are just accepting as the truth. And I felt an obligation to report on what I was hearing secondhand, but through people who had video and had the ability to prove that things were not going well there at all, and that that the government was trying to get people to believe that Afghans that were arriving were Afghans that they had rescued.
Right.
In fact, Afghans that were arriving had left on their own accord months earlier and were refugees around Afghanistan. And to me, that was a material bit of misinformation intended to create the impression that a lot more was being done than was actually being done.
You nailed it. You were just talking about Baghdad, and I was thinking back to Gulf War II. Was it Baghdad Bob? Was that it? Was that the general that was always paraded out to say we're beating the Americans? It's only a few days. It's just pure propaganda, right? And we all laughed and made memes about it. And I had that same moment when the minister said, we're going to be rescuing 40,000 Afghans. And then it got wrapped in this weird context of, freedom fighters, LGBTQ, women's rights. And I was like, what? I was like, hold on a second. I'm like, those are important issues, but hold on a sec. The issue right now is it's the individuals that fought a war with us. They're in imminent danger. Why aren't we focusing on the fact that this is imminent danger? And the people we're bringing over here, we're literally looking at the list. We compiled a list of hundreds plus, their families, which equates to thousands of Afghans that worked for the Canadian Armed Forces that we were vetting. And they're saying that there's thousands coming. And we're looking at a list. We're like, but no, there's nobody from our list that's here. So that goes exactly to what you were saying. It was misinformation because when I anecdotally talked to my relatives and friends that aren't involved in this, even veterans, like, oh yeah, we're getting people. That's awesome. Like, which interpreters? I'm like,
everybody assumed that there's 20,000 people, and I've seen a couple of them arrive at the airport. And I in that story that you mentioned, I mentioned, there were 40 people who came in, but those were people who worked at the embassy,
right?
Like, and they flew a Globemaster over the city of Toronto. I'm in Toronto now. Never seen that.
Oh, really?
But they flew it by the. Yeah. You don't see Globemasters flying past the CN Tower to land in Pearson ever.
No, that's
they land at Trenton. You might see them in the distance. That was a show, and I thought, there's an old movie, Wag the Dog, where someone says, "Okay, we're going to make it seem like there's a plane packed filled with Afghans that come down, and there were 40. And how many people does Globemaster fit normally? Like 300, somewhat. That was a mostly empty plane. With seatbelts.
Right.
Yes.
As we know now, you could fit a whole hell of a lot more if you're willing to break some protocols and just sit them on the ground.
Yeah. So I had known that there had been an evacuation plan agreed to in March by Global Affairs Canada, but only for the embassy. And as it turns out, on that day, that's who was on that big plane was mostly the embassy staff and a few people who had worked for the embassy who were Afghans. They weren't anybody on the list of thousands that you mentioned, and they were nobody certainly that had gone through the application process that they brought in the last few months. So, and we still don't know, and this is ridiculous. The government has still not released how many people have actually been evacuated who are on the list of people who are going through the application process. We know that there were 3,000 people brought out of Afghanistan by the Canadian military during that 4 days that they were on the ground in Kabul. But it seems our gut says most of them were providing transportation for other countries that have been able to get their people onto the tarmac. Canada wasn't able to get people onto the tarmac except for this group of volunteers that was able to get a couple of dozen out.
Right. Yeah, this brings up so much frustration and anger. The issue, I mean, from being in the middle of it, essentially, the Canadian government can't release numbers because they have no clue. No clue. Still don't.
You don't think so?
They're so lost in the sauce The only people that are actually making sure that there is some account is the Afghan Canadian Interpreters Group. And we don't have the full picture. We have a very small snapshot of that picture. We have accurate data, but there's still 90% of those that we have on our list that are still stuck in Afghanistan. When you see repeatedly that individuals that have made applications, that have received immigration numbers, have a document that was been sent to them, that when they reply back, there's no record of them being in the system, that's a very, very troubling response to a international emergency. So, I mean, I don't necessarily want to go down the rabbit hole of the response right now, because that's a whole other kettle of fish. But
that's worth a book.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, part of the reason why I really want to talk to you, Kevin, is there's something that needs to be put down on the record. You know, this can easily fade away into history, right? And not really have anything to look back on, because ultimately, if we don't do something like this, you know, in the military, we do AARs, after action reports. It's almost as if this needs to be pushed under the rug at the governmental level as quickly as possible. Let's not talk about it. Let's not even look into it. In my opinion, this needs to have a full-on inquiry. This needs to be looked at from top to bottom, because we can't operate as a country with departments that can't do their basic function, which is get people out of a country, refugees, where it's literally in your name, in a quickly, timely, and effective manner, and be able to be flexible to war. And so that alone, I mean, that has to be reviewed top to bottom, and there needs to be really, really objective, you know, a really objective lens put on that. Because if not,
But to do that, the government has to accept that they made mistakes, and that mistakes have been made, and that there is a problem. And to be honest, I have not seen a minister interviewed admit that there was a problem in their response. Everything is about how could we have known? We moved as quickly and as effectively as we could. We're in touch with people by email. There's no sense of contrition on this.
No.
And, you know, I've covered politics, Dave, for like 40 years on and off at all the networks. I've been a parliamentary reporter. I know the way government works. And if there were problems in individual departments, I think there was a bigger problem in the coordination between those departments, and that there was none. You know, global affairs couldn't seem to find a way to communicate with Canadian to Canadian was the problem here. It wasn't, and, you know, Canadian to American in some cases, because I think one of the other things we learned is that our reflux that, well, the Americans will take care of us, we don't need to be there, we can just call in that chip. It didn't happen in this case, because the Americans had their own interests and they had their own people to get out quickly.
Right.
So, I think one of the lines in that story that I wrote for The Line was that, you know, alliances are supposed to be about burden sharing, but in Kabul in the last few weeks, Canada has only been a burden.
Yeah. That's exactly it. And
that doesn't feel good, right?
No, because then you're like that pesky little brother that always needs a helping hand no matter what. You can never grow up. You're not an adult. Even when becoming of age, you're still that dependent little kid. And that's how I see my government now, is that we're just a bunch of bungling little kids with official titles that actually can't get anything done. And it's an embarrassment for me now to look at my country from this perspective, just from this one issue alone, because we had an obligation, we had an unwritten contract. You don't leave your allies to be killed in a country that we spent the longest amount of time in during a war, the longest war in Canadian history. And yet we just figured, you know what, we're done. We physically pulled out our troops, therefore that we have no more responsibility. And I just can't accept that. And I want to just read just a small snippet of that article we're talking about, because it's really good. And I encourage you folks, if you're listening to this, I'm going to post this in the show notes. Have a read. It's really, really well written, obviously, because Kevin knows what he's doing. So these early days of this massive rescue effort by Western countries revealed some unflattering aspects of our national character. Canada has been slow to react, risk-averse, and selfish. We've relied on our neighbors more than each other, turned our backs on thousands who proved their loyalty to us, and even blamed criminals for our inability to protect people we know are in real fear of being murdered. that sums it up so succinctly. That's exactly how I felt, and that's why I was dancing around trying to get some people to pay attention. And it was Paul Carroll, a friend of mine, that jumped on board here to really lend a helping hand because I needed it desperately. Basically said like, yeah, you're dancing off and over on the corner, and I had to kind of ask like, hey, why are you trying to get all this attention? And then realized, oh crap, this is a really big, serious issue. And we all just assumed as veterans that as soon as we bring this issue to the fore, it will be addressed and the proper authorities will take over. But what we witnessed was not the case at all. So to segue into the last thing I just wanted to cover was one of the most poignant days was the day that the Taliban officially took over Kabul. Now, I remember this day very well because it was my daughter's birthday. It was August 16th. I guess the dichotomy or the difference in realities where I'm on my phone looking at texts from friends and of Afghans, of their family members, literally like, oh my God, they're coming, they're going to kill us, and I'm having a happy moment with my daughter and my family, was so hard to kind of regulate. And my wife noticed it right away. Like, you okay? I'm like, no, I'm not doing well. Like this, I need a moment. And it was a heartbreaking moment, like one that I haven't ever experienced, because we worked so hard. We knew this day was coming. We made sure that, proper authorities knew we need to act fast, and yet we still didn't do the right thing. And you wrote a great article that's called "The Canal Where the Bomb Went Off Was the Only Way Out." So this highlights what happened at the Abbey Gate. Can you give us a little bit more context as to what you were experiencing on your end, and how this article kind of took shape from your perspective?
Yeah. So you know that there were many days where Canadian government officials were telling people to go to certain places through Taliban checkpoints at that point. So it was a dangerous trip, and saying, if you can get there, there's a flight ready for you. You'll be able to board. And so people would go to the place. They'd wear red to identify themselves, which I'm not sure was the smartest thing to do if the Taliban is, looking for people trying to get out of the country. It was a very public thing to do. And I think, unfortunately, people making the policy were not in Iraq because we pulled out all our diplomats and military attachés. So the people making these policies were in Ottawa, where they wouldn't understand the ground reality of what these people were going through at all. And and then we thought we were on board there, that the Northeast Gate, and I've since discovered from my reporting that that gate was taken away by the Americans and a certain three-lettered agency that needed it. And so all our people then had to move down through another checkpoint to another location, and they were lumped in with the UK Army, because at that point the Americans looked at us and they said, you're not bringing anything to this game. We need the gate. We got work to do. Maybe the Brits will take care of you. And so the British did for a while. We moved everybody down to the British gate. And that physically, just for your listeners, was like, there was a hotel, and then there was a long sort of sewage water drainage area of about 1 kilometer long. And then at the other end, there was like a security gate that you would get through to the tarmac. The problem was there were so many other countries there at the same time. And, other countries were able to negotiate, because they had people in Afghanistan at the time, passage for their military to leave the base, to go and extract people, drive them in other entrances. We had none of that infrastructure. There was this group of volunteers, and like one guy, Canadian Dave, who's been featured on the Fifth Estate and on W5. And he was it, because from what I've been able to ascertain, even though the government said that there was permission for Canadian forces to leave the airport and go outside of the perimeter, they did not give them permission to go out and run missions with vans and stuff to extract people and get them into the airport. They just said, well, I guess if we don't have permission to do that, then all they can do is stand in that sewer and hope that we can get them through. Of course, Dave, that made them an enormous soft target for for those in Afghanistan at the time that were trying to fuck this up.
Yeah.
And fuck it up they did. They detonated a bomb. But one of the great advantages of the group of people that we have together is that you had people there that were very experienced soldiers at a high level, operators in Afghanistan, and they could smell it. And so we were able to communicate to our people there, do not stay. You're just too big of a target. And then through our networks as well, we were getting some intel from the US that the ISIS-K was forming and was interested in fucking up the airport. So we were able to pick up stuff. We didn't, and then we were able to act on some intel that we received from the Canadian military to get them the hell out of there. So in the end, it worked, but it could have been, and we still don't know whether or not we don't believe any of the applicants to Canada were murdered in that IED explosion, or in that backpack bomb, but they could have been, and it would have been because all of government told them to go there and kind of made them sitting ducks.
Right. Exactly.
And so it was terrifying. It was because like we're just a bunch of Canadians using what ability we have to navigate from a distance. We're not there. And you talk about a relationship with risk. That was a risky thing to tell them to go, and it was a risk that the government hasn't borne itself. It's relied on people like us to take up.
Yep.
So it's not easy.
I remember that day so vividly because we were just getting the updates like, okay, Abbey Gate's open. They need to go to the Baron Hotel, wait out. I believe that's where Canadian Dave was. And I'm talking to, my interpreter's family and another interpreter, and they're writing me like, do I go here now? I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, I don't
know what to say.
How do I say yes? And how do I say no? I'm literally sitting at home on a phone. Your life is now in my hands. This is too fucked up. I remember after, we got a bit of intel and said like, hey, like we're sitting ducks. We got to get the hell out of here. I remember the messages went out. I told my interpreter, who was actually already in the UK, to tell his family, get the fuck out right now, like immediately. And he wrote me back like a few hours later. He's like, thank God, Dave, that you wrote me that, because he's like, they were there and they left about 5 minutes before it went off. And, like that, man.
I had the same experience with a couple of guys. It's just like, I don't want to leave because like, think about these people. Like they think there's a plane waiting for them. This may be their last chance. And they're being told that the plane leaves at 5 and we're telling them get the hell out of there because we can't guarantee your safety. And we put them in this horrific Sophie's choice of, that way might be Canada, even though I'm standing in a sewer, but that way sure isn't. I know what's on that side. That side's the Taliban. And we told them to go back into their arms because that was safer at that moment. The right call, but what a terrible position we put those people in.
I know. We also lost, I believe it was 13 American service members as well in that attack. Like just the to add insult to injury, right? Like you knew that was coming. You knew sitting ducks was a perfect way to describe it. And you just mentioned Sophie's choice, and I want to just read an excerpt from this article that you wrote because it really encapsulates it perfectly. So this is from Kevin's article about the canal where the bomb went off. So what happened next to Syed? Now, Syed is somebody that you had contact with, a former interpreter.
Right, and we didn't use real names.
Didn't use real names, of course. Yeah. So his wife, children, brothers, and sisters was typical of the Canadian government's uncoordinated, unsophisticated response to this crisis. They had applied as a family for immigration to Canada, but their applications were approved individually. This meant families were separated by Canadian officials and soldiers on the ground. Just as Donald Trump's border agents did to families at the Mexican border, they were given an impossible Sophie's choice. Send the members of the family approved to come to Canada and leave the others behind, or stay together and miss what may be their only flight to safety. Who does that to people fearing for their lives. Canada did that. I mean, like that's still like
It's the truth.
It's the truth, and it's just so
it hurts.
Yeah,
it hurts me to write them. And even as you're reading it back, I'm getting my Irish up about it. But no, I mean that's what we did. I mean, you saw those pictures, guys, like families handing their children up to soldiers because the children had been approved, but their wife hadn't. So, it was terrible. And I don't know. I mean, some families got out whole, more as we were able to collect ourselves. But by and large, most of the families that have been able to get out are not the whole file.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we should mention that, like, probably to our surprise, the Taliban is, they're trying to make money out of this situation, to get people out. But so far, they haven't. They are stopping some Afghan nationals in some places, but there hasn't been a wholesale closing of the borders yet. Mm-hmm. That may yet come. I'm a little older than you, and I remember in the Iran Revolution and in Vietnam, like they gave a few months for people to extract their people, but if you're not extracting them, there will come a time where the Taliban will say, "That's it, time's up, borders are shut." And I think that's what's infused all of us, is that we know this, right? Mm-hmm. And known it for years, that once they're back in charge, you can't count on anything. And that's why it was so important to try to get them to get out before the Taliban took control. And sadly, we weren't able to do it.
You bring up, and I know we're at a crunch for time, and I just want to point out, you mentioned images. The most iconic one is babies being passed over to American troops.
Yeah,
we had a golden moment for our country, for the Canadian Armed Forces, to have a huge morale win. Canadian Armed Forces, as you know, is a bit embattled right now. We're not doing so well when it comes to morale. We've got a lot of scandals going on. What we needed was a win. The country needed a win. What better win than to have Canadian soldiers bring in children, women and children onto a plane, helping them, doing what we do best. But we never got those images. The only images that we got to see were troops not doing anything, and not because they didn't want to, but because they were ordered not to. And I'm just, I'm just.
Well, I know, and you heard it, and I know enough soldiers that there's a deep soul searching going on internally in the Canadian Armed Forces about, like, why do we train for exactly this kind of mission if we don't ever get to carry it out?
They're the ones that can take on the risk. They're like, if you had called me and like, Dave, put on your armor, let's go. Like, that gets me fired up, and I imagine, like 25, 26, 30-year-old dude that's like, let's get some action. Like, let's help some people. Like, that is fundamentally what we want to do, and put ourselves in danger to make that happen. But to hamstring them, not allow them to do it. I can only imagine what those, so I don't know any of the soldiers that were there, but I can only imagine psychologically how that it could break you.
Well, the worst thing is, if you're there and you can see what the fix is and you're prevented from doing that, that's just not good for your soul. I think, and I also think that, there's some thinking to be done about the extraction team that trains for this kind of work, but was not given permission to execute it. I don't know why that was, whether that was a political decision or whether that was a decision solely that was military. But there's a lot of people asking, well, what are we for if not for that?
Precisely. So Kevin, this has been an awesome discussion, and your perspective from this is obviously very valued. And moving forward, I hope we can have more conversations. And obviously, this is not over. We need more reporting on this. We need to get more Canadians engaged and involved. And it seems like it's picking up again. I don't know if it's because it's Remembrance Day coming up, but there definitely is an uptick in interest. And I hope that continues. And I hope you're still, going to produce a lot of good content on Substack, but with the line. And folks, if you're, we talked earlier about mainstream media not having a lot of money to do things. If you're looking for really good, objective, high quality journalism, I love the line. I think it's
Yeah, Jen's doing
they're doing a great job
with it.
there, and I've subscribed and I'm paying for it because I believe in really good journalism, and we can't just have it based on clicks and clickbait titles. We need to have good journalism done by good journalists that actually get paid to do it. So, Kevin, I really appreciate you sitting down. Do you have any last final thoughts before we sign off?
No, I just want to say that one of the happier parts of this experience, and it sounds weird to say that there is some, but there is that there are groups of, very well-trained soldiers, journalists who have been in war zones, NGOs. Typically we don't mix very often in a common mission. Sometimes we're at cross purposes in a mission. But I think one of the things that this fine group of Canadians has realized is that my respect for the leadership training in the Canadian Armed Forces has increased. I think their respect for what journalists can do and what they're able to accomplish in places through their sources and their wide sources, and just the passion that NGOs have and in understanding the culture. When you bring all that together, when you do actually create a Team Canada to solve the problem, not great things happen, but better things happen at least.
Absolutely. I think we're experiencing just a shift in era, and the small adaptable teams with highly skilled individuals that can make things happen in a much more flexible manner is where we're moving towards. And I think we're at the pointy edge of the spear to a new way of doing things, and the old model clearly is broken. So I don't know where this is going to go, but it was definitely an experience. I've said that a lot.
Yeah,
but I think
thank God you were lifting through it, because you needed something to get rid of that stress, man. And I think of a lot of my veteran buddies and how hard this has been for them to feel powerless in this moment. So
yeah,
lots of loves and kisses there.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely a lot of like one of my friends said, a lot of clenched fists, scotch, and tears. Yeah. Thanks again, Kevin. Really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk with me. I'm very humbled by it. And folks, if you want to get a hold of Kevin Newman or see more of his stuff online, Kevin, where's the best place to find your work now?
If you go to theline.ca, that tends to be where I am. And then Google my name on Vimeo, and you'll see some of my reporting from Afghanistan too.
Right on. Awesome. Thanks a bunch, Kevin. And folks,
Cheers.
Don't forget, train hard, fight easy. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. You can find out more about training, nutrition, and mindset at davemorrow.net. Be sure to like us on Facebook and Instagram at Dave Morrow PT. And don't forget, strong people are hard to kill.